And for more on the next steps of the legal process in this death penalty case, let's now turn to former federal and state prosecutor David Weinstein. David, good morning. Welcome back.
Good morning, Hena.
So the jurors, you heard Caitlin, in delivering their death penalty sentence, said, quote, "These murders were especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel, manifesting exceptional depravity, and that exhibited utter disregard for human life." David, that language specifically, what does that tell you?
Well, look, that tells me that the jurors considered the aggravating factors, and those are the terms that are used when they're asking these jurors to consider what the appropriate penalty is to impose. And as you just discussed, the factors here were really outrageous concerning both the manner of death of these two young children and then the fact that their bodies were buried on his property and that he took off afterwards knowing exactly what he had done. It's one of those cases where jurors really don't have a hard time making a decision what the appropriate penalty is. And while this is going to go under scrutiny as it works its way up the appellate route, I don't think the Court of Appeals is going to have very much difficulty deciding that this was the appropriate punishment either.
Well, so Daybell was sentenced on Saturday. He's going to appeal this verdict. To your point, the evidence seems overwhelming. So what legal grounds do they have to stand on when it comes to an appeal?
Well, they're most likely going to argue about the mitigating factors and that those, although considered, outweighed in their mind the aggravating factors and that the jurors were perhaps prejudiced by the way the evidence was presented. They'll also be able to attack other issues that were raised during the course of the case that had to do with admissibility of evidence, what the jurors were shown, which pictures they were shown. And then, from there, they'll look at whether or not the balancing factors were given enough time and consideration by these jurors and then ultimately by the judge as well.
David, at this point, which would be a priority? Would it be appealing the verdict or appealing the death penalty, the sentence?
Well, they're both going to happen at the same time. And while they're appealing the verdict, look, if the verdict's overturned because of errors that were committed during the course of the trial, that means the sentence goes out. If the conviction is affirmed, then they're going to have to rely on whether or not they can get their sentence, the death penalty that is, overturned. The U.S. Supreme Court's weighed in on this already. They've overturned other cases. So the standards are well known as to what has to be considered by jurors and by the judges. And I would have to think that the prosecutors were well aware of what those standards were and that they buttoned their case up to make sure that neither the verdict on his conviction or on his sentence are going to be overturned.
David, walk us through what an appeal process would look like.
Well, it's not as exciting as a trial. It's all based on the record. And so you have to assemble the record, and that would be putting together all the testimony. The court reporter took down the testimony from the witnesses, getting the record together, and then getting that transmitted up to the Court of Appeals. The defendant is going to write his brief first. Then the prosecutors will have an opportunity to respond. Then the defendant writes what's called a reply brief, and the judges consider the evidence that's been presented to them. It'll go up through several levels. It'll ultimately end up at the highest Court of Appeals of the state. They'll make their decision. If it's adverse, meaning the conviction's upheld and then the sentence upheld as well, they'll then petition the U.S. Supreme Court to ask them to consider whether or not the verdict and the sentence were just. From there, in all likelihood, if he keeps losing his way up the appellate ladder, he'll probably decide that at this point in time, he's going to claim that his attorneys were ineffective and see if that route doesn't work for him as well. It's a long process, especially in the case of a death penalty sentence. So this is going to go on for not just some months, but for some years, Hena.
Thanks for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find News Nation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.